Hello and welcome back to OT, the podcast. We are here to talk about watches, time, and how to spend it. My name is Andy Green.
They call me Felix Schultz.
Or Mr. Schultz, depending who is addressing you.
Only people that are addressing me like in official capacities, like the courts.
Yeah, which is often, Mr. Schultz is my father.
Oh. You know who we've got on the podcast today, Andy Green?
Does his name rhyme with Schmerich Schmind?
Mr. Wind. Yes, we have
Mr. Wind.
Mr. Wind, vintage watch
From?
dealer. And I would say all-round gentleman. He just seems like a superlative person. Eric Wind. He's from the internet, really. Got his own.
Yeah, Wind Vintage.
Wind Vintage, and he pops up all over the shop. He's ex-Hodinky.
Yeah.
He's just the go-to guy if you need to know about vintage watches. The thing I like, I mean, let's not get into it. We'll let him talk. A bit of an interesting episode.
It's very interesting. And I think, just quickly, Eric is the kind of guy who would be an amazing dinner guest. Just because, not because of how polite and lovely he is, but the stories this man can tell. And one thing we get into, which is a bit of a teaser to make sure you'll all listen to the end, is his story of placing the Paul Newman Rolex Daytona in Crazy Rich Asians.
Yes.
Which is just super rando, super cool, really, really awesome story. He'll dine out on that for the rest of his life.
Absolutely. Hey, Andy, have you been up to anything recently?
Oh, maybe.
Have you been anywhere?
Maybe we've been up to things. Yes, we had a road trip. OT had I think this is our first road trip. We went down the Mornington Peninsula to a lovely kind of winery / hotel, Jackalope.
Yeah,
look it up.
Bit trendy, the old Jackalope.
Stunning.
Little rain room.
Very trendy. Probably too cool for us.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, so we sat, had a lovely lunch overlooking the vineyards in a sunny sort of Victorian day.
It was lovely, and JLC were down. They were showing off some of their newer releases. They had some lovely Jarre tourbillons, some reverso tourbillons, and some regular reversos along for the ride. Did you see anything you liked watch-wise, Andy?
Yeah, that Jarre tourbillon was awesome. Just like stunning to look at. And then the reverso, that burgundy reverso, which I have to check exactly which one it was.
Recent release, like the late 2020 release. I'm not sure. We'll link it up, Andy. We'll link it up.
Yeah, I found it. So It is the Tribute Small Seconds reference 397846J. I think technically 2019, but 2020 didn't count, as we all know. It's got that wine red dial, which made sense for a winery. Just really nice. Really, really nice watch. Every time I see a reverso and try one on, I just think to myself, I need to get one.
Do you know what I was?
It's.
Oh, you go.
No, it's just on the list. There's those watches. It's next to sort of the Santos Dumont from Cartier.
Sure. Do you know what I was most into on that watch? And this is a weird Felix thing.
What's that?
The strap.
You can what?
The strap on the reverso. It had a cool textile leather combo strap, kind of like old school sporty.
Which I think, it did actually. The strap was definitely textured.
Which, if you want a watch that's like a 1930s sport watch, is where it sort of came from. It's exactly the sort of strap you can imagine having.
Yeah, perfect.
But watches weren't the only good. In fact, no shade to JLC. The main thing I enjoyed about this event was seeing other people. It was like the first time in over a year for an IRL watch event. And it was just nice. I mean, there were some great guys there.
Force. Yeah, so, big names around town. Anthony Doe. Good to catch up with Anthony.
Yeah.
A couple of the guys from Fifth Wrist Radio, I think, at JP Melbs, if you follow him on Instagram.
And Vinny
also.
I don't remember his Instagram handle. Tell Your Time. Is it Tell Your Time? Not My Time.
Yes.
What are those?
Tell your time, Felix.
I'm pretty sure that's an advertising slogan. Your time. Tell your time. With
and of course, Jason and Nick from Time and Tide.
Oh yeah, the lovely Jason and Nick. Nick was very enamored with that the Caliber 101 tennis bracelet watch. I may have said he was too enthusiastic about it. He just
I know he took that out like 3 times, which was quite funny. He kind of kept asking to take it out. It was stunning though. I'll post a video of that
yeah.
because
We'll link up his gram. We'll link
yeah,
up
I
some
think
pics.
200 yeah, yeah. Actually, well, we share his post. The 220,000 euros for that bad boy. But absolutely stunning. Like the way that, and it was a sunny day. The way that the diamonds on that sort of tennis bracelet sparkled it's insane. Like it didn't look real, and it's very rare that sort of you see diamonds in that light of that sort of quality and caliber and all that sort of stuff. But it was truly stunning.
Nice. What else, Andy? What else has been piquing your interest in the non-physical watch catch-up context?
Well, I got to say, Felix, blink and you'll miss it. This is the way with limited editions.
Mm-hmm.
But our friend King Nerd came up recently. Is coming up again. He
Oh,
did a collaboration with G Shock, 300 pieces worldwide, based on the iconic GM 6900.
I know it well.
And he did the well, right? So it's sort of a golden case, and then he did a black strap with sort of an engraving pattern on it. Stunning, stunning. So it comes with a hand signed and numbered print,
Oh, cool.
bespoke packaging, the full shebang.
Mm-hmm.
And really, really cool to see this happen for Johnny because I imagine he's been working on a few projects and things coming to a boil at different times. It just so happens it's all happening at once for him. They sold out more or less instantly, from what I hear. So, congrats to Johnny and the team from G Shock.
Yeah, and while we're talking about G-Shock,
If you've listened to us before, you're probably aware that we're both big into our G Shocks. Like any serious watch collectors, Felix and I own a bunch that we've collected over the years. And G Shock is a brand that seems to pop up every other week. You might remember, our guests sharing their love for the brands. If I think recently, Sean Stockman from Boys to Men or Adam Kraniotes from Red Bar. And that's just a few examples. Today, though, thanks to G Shock, we're trying out some watches from their MTG line.
Andy, I've always wanted to know, what is an MTG?
Get ready, it's a bit of a tongue twister. It's one of the premium collections in the G Shock family, and it stands for Metal Twister G Shock, which should really give you a sense of what we're playing with here. Stainless steel cases and bracelets.
Absolutely. So I'm not wearing it now because I took it off to look at it. The one I've got is the fully black ion plated number with a Bordeaux bezel, which you might call purpley red, Andy.
Oh, fancy. And the one I've been rocking is the polished stainless steel with a black ion plated bezel. In some ways, though, the steel is part of the appeal. They come with a carbon core guard structure for better shock resistance, sapphire crystal, 200 meters of water resistance, and so many other functions, like a second time zone, calendar, alarm solar power, and even an LED light.
I live in for that LED light, Andy. I press it. I press it all the time, and thank God it's solar, because otherwise I'd be needing a new battery, every other month. But you know what else I really like about it? The smartphone app. I have been through the drama before with the G-Shock of trying to change a function, like change the date or something like that. And I can tell you that flicking through that tiny G-Shock manual with my German-sized fingers is not something that comes easily. With the G-Shock connected app, it's a lot more user friendly. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, it sure is. How have you found it on the wrist?
Solid. I'm not going to lie though, it's a big boy. It's 55.1 mil across by 51 tall by 15.9 mil high. Thanks though to that carbon core, it's not too heavy. So on the bracelet, it weighs in at 156 grams. For me, I think it's a good work watch. Even when I'm
Mm.
working at home, I can wear it comfortably. I don't have to worry about, sort of banging it into things, which does happen around the house. I'm a klutz. And there's a really sort of nice, pleasing sort of tactility and feel on the wrist. How have you found it, Andy?
Yeah, I agree. It is a little bit bigger, but it doesn't really have lugs, so I think that kind of takes a few millimeters off what you might expect. I've been wearing it around too, wearing it to the gym. Really, it's right at home. Yeah, the polished steel fits in with the decorum. The black bezel looks really really cool, and that 156 grams doesn't add a heap of weight. When I'm throwing around, a couple hundred kilos on the deadlift
Yeah,
bar.
you're not feeling it
And
on
the other thing I
that.
really
Yeah.
tipped me over the edge. But what I do find is I'm someone at the gym who sort of puts their phone down and kind of forgets about it and then struggles to find it on the way out. And I've been using the Find My Phone feature through the which you set up through the app, and basically you can use the watch to set off 3 or 4 different tracks on your phone that just blast out until you stop it, and that has come in handy a few times.
True, 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 true. Now, for all the reference fans out there, I know you've been waiting for this. I've been wearing the MTGB 2000BD-1A4, and Andy has been wearing the MTGB
Ooh.
2000D-1A. As you know, that's what we like to call them. The RRPs for those guys are 1749 and 1899 Australian dollars. We will link them up in the show notes. We'll link up some pics, all the specs, all that stuff. Or you could just head to g-shockaustralia.com.au for more. Now we're going to get back to that episode, Andy.
Let's get at it. Hey, Felix, what you been liking?
A website that's an exhibition. That's a very 2021 statement to make, isn't it? It's
Tell me more.
It's something called The Persistence of Memory that has been put on by well-known retailers, the Hourglass. And it's have you had a chance to check it out?
Of course. Of course.
It's pretty phenomenal. Like so I imagine, they've been working on this for a while, and it's an exhibition. I'll read the opening spiel from the press release to give you a bit of a sense of what it is before we get into the deets. Before the emergence of formalized structures of watch production in the early 19th century, serving as precursors to modern watch manufacturing houses we know today, watchmaking existed in a cottage industry-like setting where watchmakers pursued their métier, independent of the commerciality, enterprise, and the rigidness of industry. How's that for an art history introduction to a thing?
Not bad.
So
Not bad at
basically,
all.
I imagine this would have been a beautiful traveling exhibition around their boutiques if this was happening in different times, but instead they turned it into a quite immersive website. So they've got a bunch of watches from some of the most significant independent watchmakers of last century. So like Philippe Bourgeois, George Daniels, the obvious ones, and then there's other sort of names, F.B.
Ever.
Jean, Erver. Frank Mueller's a really interesting one that I checked out. He was
Oh.
super important in the 80s and 90s. So, and also more modern, younger people coming up like Recep Recep from Akrivia. It's really, really quite good to check out. Like there's lots and lots of macro photography. They break down the watches in detail. There's sort of interview elements and links to sort of other important, interviews and stories about the watchmakers. It's a good oversight of this particular sort of part of the industry, which is somewhere where Hourglass, really sort of
Yeah, they're
they
big on the
advocate
ears.
for it. Like they really, there's not always a commercial interest there for them to promote George Daniels, for example, but they do a really good job sort of heroing these guys.
And even I learned some stuff. I discovered who Remy Cools was.
Yeah, wow, he sounds cool.
Yeah, he's doing a pretty cool tourbillon. And as I, Googled him, I discovered that he'd been featured on Hodinkee, and I'm guessing the Hourglass, sells some of his pieces somewhere. But he's a 24-year-old watchmaker doing some pretty stunning work. So
Well, yeah,
yeah,
I mean, it's like
cool.
they're like patrons, I guess, in that old sort of sense. Anyway, you know who else would probably really be into this Hourglass exhibition website?
I'm gonna say it's Mr. Wind.
I reckon he could be right. Did we get him on?
We can call him and ask him.
Today's guest is just about a household name as far as vintage watch authorities go. He was one of the very first Hodinkee writers who brought us the Bring a Loop column and some truly excellent histories of presidential timepieces. From then on, he's gone to work in Christie's watch department before heading out on his own to buy and sell some of the world's finest vintage watches. In 2020, Rob Report named him the best vintage watch expert of the year, and today we have him on OT the podcast. Eric Wind, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be on here, Felix and Andy.
Great to have you on, Eric.
It's great to have you.
Eric, for the people who don't know who you are, and I'm sure there's some gaps to fill in, who is Eric Wind, and what is Wind Vintage?
Okay, I'll give you a 2-minute synopsis, but I'm from Wisconsin originally, began writing for Hodinkee maybe a week or two before Felix back in spring 2010. And we were unpaid at the time, but passionate watch enthusiasts. and just loved vintage watches. Um, and then began writing, regularly for Hodinkee. Kind of took charge of the "What's Selling Where" column that was renamed
Hmm.
"Bring a Loop," and did that for a number of years. Wrote about auctions, etc. And then I got a job offer from Christie's to become the vice president, senior special of watches there under John Reardon, who was a friend and also Hodinkee contributor. So I was working in biofuel at that time,
Mm.
but decided to make the move to watches full time, which I never have looked back with any regret. I love it. I worked at Christie's for a little over 2 years before I decided to put in notice that I wanted to start my own company to better serve clients, buying, selling, and advising clients on mostly vintage watches. So I started that almost 3.5 years ago, and based in Palm Beach, Florida, and very happy to be in Florida and love what I do.
Outstanding. So we thought we'd take the opportunity because we haven't really had a vintage watch expert of quite your sort of pedigree on the podcast before. So we thought we'd do things a little bit differently this time around. We thought we'd speak to you about how you go around buying watches and maybe giving some advice to people who are getting into the vintage watch buying space themselves, but also
Mhm.
later on how you do the same with selling watches. So I think the first question is, where do you buy watches, Eric?
So it's a variety of places. The Wild West is kind of eBay. Um,
Hmm.
I do go on eBay every day, get eBay alerts for different searches, etc. So that's one thing. It is not easy to buy something like a vintage Rolex on eBay. It's very dangerous, despite what they'll tell you about their new authenticity program. But I basically don't buy Rolex watches on eBay typically. It's more off the mainstream stuff. So Vulcan, Angelus, some Hoyers, Omegas, not probably Speedmasters typically, but other things. Um, Things that are less likely to be messed with, hopefully from more estate type collectors or pickers or things like that, rather than dealers. Um, so yeah, that I use that just as one thing. Chrono 24, I've used more this year than any other. They seem to be getting more interesting watches listed across categories, and sometimes you'll see something that looks really nice that's listed by maybe a private individual, original
Hmm.
owner, original family, things like that. So that again, not typically Rolex per se, but other things. And I've had very good experiences there. And then you got other avenues. I probably get offered a few watches a day on Instagram via direct
Hmm.
message. So always checking those out. Sometimes direct emails into my info at winvintage.com website
Nice
from
plug.
people that come across, my website or my name in newspaper articles, things like that. Found some great watches that way. The other kind of two other avenues. One, I'm part of a few different WhatsApp groups.
Hmm.
So, dealers listing things they have for sale. Sometimes you see something really nice, um, and you click that you want to buy it. You sometimes have to move fast on these things because multiple dealers will say buy very quickly, and kind of whoever says it first gets it. And then obviously auctions. I'm always looking at auctions every day, whether it's the big auctions, Sotheby's, Christie's, Phillips, or the whole array of kind of smaller auction houses, which in many ways I prefer because the watches seem more honest and fresh from
Hmm.
original owners and original families. So you can sometimes find really great watches that are mispriced, or they're just kind of under the radar. All they need is a new crystal, or you know an ultrasonic bath of the case, things like that, which can make the watch look 1,000 times better than it looked, with tons of dirt on it.
I imagine we're talking about you as a individual here.
Yes.
I know you mentioned sort of the dealer groups. What about when you're actually finding the stock? Is it all online for you now, or is there wholesale meetups and secret groups that move things around for 30% under market? Like how do you source the watches that you then sell? Is it the same
It's
method?
all those same methods. There's a group called IWJG that meets in person as well. Um, but hasn't been meeting as much obviously this
Mm,
year. But that is not where I typically buy watches. It's more the other avenues. Also, collector clients that I work with that may be wanting to move a few pieces, find a few pieces, and really the last um, piece I was going to mention is just relationships with retailers, Rolex retailers, and others, where an original owner, original family member of the original owner walks in
Mm.
and has a watch to sell. Those are obviously generally pretty nice and untouched if you can get access to it. And usually that's a competitive situation where the store offers it to a few vintage dealers or experts, and whoever offers the most gets it. So,
Yeah, fascinating. Of course, that does make sense. If your granddad bought a watch back there in the 50s, that might be the first
love
place to
that.
go and sell it.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's not a situation where most people off the street have that sort of situation, but a
No.
lot of those ones like eBay and auctions and sort of retailers is perfectly fine for someone that just wants to buy a nice vintage watch. Maybe it's a Speedmaster, maybe it's a Rolex, or maybe it's something a little bit more niche. Where would you suggest people start looking to buy a vintage watch?
I guess it sort of depends on what you're looking for first. Um, so, and budget is a key part of that. So, some, dealer, I get asked a lot, do you have any great vintage watches for sale under $2,000? And generally the answer is no, because either I'm keeping it or I'm wholesaling it or selling it through the
Mm,
Hodinkee shop or something like that. It's a lot of hand holding for the sale of any watch.
hmm
And in one respect, I would say selling a watch under $2,000 actually takes a lot more time and effort than selling a watch over $100,000 typically. As the buyer at the $100,000 level usually knows what they're doing and has multiple watches, etc. They're not going to be complaining that the watch is off by a minute a day or something like that in terms of accuracy. Um, so it really depends. There are certain dealers like those watch guys that kind of specialize in the under $2,000 watches. They're really nice guys that are in their early 20s, recent college graduates. There's a whole host of kind of dealers like that. Um, if you're looking for higher end things, you and I guess by that I would kind of categorize it as like $50,000 and above.
hmm
You kind of have to know what you're looking for, and I feel develop a relationship with maybe one or two dealers rather than running around to everyone. As I told someone recently who was trying to get into it, I said you kind of have to pick your jockey, who you want to work with. You can't be talking to 20 different dealers. You're going to get 20 different opinions, and everyone's going to cut down each other's watch that they're offering you privately, etc.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a really good tip. You do see that. You see that quite a bit, and you see sort of difference of opinions. Even you see groups of dealers that hang out together and sort of friends, but everyone has different opinions. On that note, and sort of, it doesn't matter whether it's a $2,000 watch or it's a $200,000 watch. Buying vintage can be quite scary to all levels of watch enthusiasts. Do you have any tips for maybe a sensible approach to buying vintage watches? What's
yeah,
do you have some golden rules?
yeah. So I gave a talk to the Horological Society of New York in spring 2019 that goes through my kind of where I see people making mistakes, the biggest mistakes that new collectors make, but also old collectors, if you will. And
hmm
I probably the most useful thing is toward the end. I have like a what I call the watch checklist manifesto, but it's like a series of questions which are just automatically in most dealers or collectors' minds, but that a new collector might not think about. So, examples of the questions: where is the watch from? The provenance, not just the dealer, but who had it before that? Where was it, since it was purchased new? If you can learn more about that, and it's not just someone telling stories and
Mhm.
tales, but actual information about where the watch came from, that can be useful to kind of indicating the watch is a real thing, not pieced together, a week ago at a watchmaker's bench. To uh, luminous material, if it has lume, whether that's tritium or radium, is that original, or has it been redone? In a sense, um, you know, there's a lot of attention paid to that, and that can affect a watch, you know, by a massive amount, 90% plus if it's relumed, which is in a sense a little bit crazy, but it is very important for the collector community. Obviously, if
I'll
the
jump in
die,
here, Eric.
yeah.
How do you test that, and why is it important?
Um, so you can test it through a few ways. One is like a simple, powerful UV flashlight, which is about 9 or 10 US dollars on Amazon. Um, those are one way to look at it, make sure it glows correctly. Different lume glows differently. So radium from the 1950s is kind of a grainy look, typically under UV, where you see little black dots in it. Tritium
Mhm.
from the um, 60s, late 60s, has more of a green, intense glow. And then, like superluminova used today, has more of a bluish tint. And then these things glow for a period of time. When you turn the light off, sometimes it'll stop immediately. For radium, you use Geiger counters to test the radioactivity level in microsieverts per hour. So you put this little device up to it, and it tells you how powerful the radiation is. Um, and there's a lot of watches that are now being relumed, whether it's with tritium or radium, so it becomes much harder for someone to tell unless they're an expert. And even experts are getting fooled because people basically buy old alarm clocks and scrape the radium out and do all
Mm.
kinds of different things to deceive, because that lume could mean the difference in value from it being worth 20,000 and the watch being worth 100,000. So it's kind of silly in a sense, but the flashlights as well let you see the difference between the dial and the hands. If there is one, it should be pretty uniform as a general rule. It should glow the same color and kind of intensity under UV light. And when you turn it off, it should all stop glowing at the same time too, again as a general rule.
Cool, 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 cool. All right, and so we'll back to your sort of tips for buying
Yeah,
watches.
yeah, yeah,
Checking the lume is one thing that sort of indicates that the parts are all correct.
yeah.
Is there any
um,
other processes you have?
Yeah. Other questions include, can you find comparable watches in terms of
Hmm.
this configuration and serial number? If there is a serial number, things that are basically the same, or is this wildly different in terms of the dial and hands and other bezel and things like that? So if it's a one-off unique piece, that's usually not a good sign. It's possible it's unique, but in general, it's unlikely that you would be having a unique watch. Um, and then checking with the manufacturer if they have any information about the watch.
Interesting.
Um, that the extracts that are critically important for buying vintage Patek Philippe watches. Obviously, Rolex does not have extracts, but if they ever did, that would be very interesting. But a bunch of brands have them: Longines, Jaeger-LeCoultre, Audemars Piguet, Vacheron Constant. You can make sure that the movement and case numbers match up, that all the details of the watch, sometimes they have the information on what the dial and hands were originally, make sure those correspond to their records if they share that publicly. Um, and then, just other details of the watch, that all the aspects are correct, whether it's the crown, the pushers, if it's a chronograph, the case back, even crystal sometimes can have a big impact on the watch's functionality and how it looks, hands, all the little aspects of the watch, that they're correct based on what we know is what we've seen in other watches, really.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good sort of, running list for anyone, even if it's, their first time or their 50th time. You can easily sort of get caught up in the moment and maybe forget to check some of those,
Yeah, yeah,
details if the price is too good.
yep.
I just wanted to, obviously, while we've got you on, what do you think, in the sort of quickly changing vintage marketplace, what are some key models that you think people should look out for or you're looking out for this year?
Um, Probably over half of my business is Rolex and vintage Rolex. I would say
Hmm.
obviously mostly vintage Rolex. So those are always at the forefront of what I'm trying to find. I mean, I can't find enough unpolished vintage watches. Otherwise, I could sell even a lot more watches. So, that polishing, some people disagree on whether it's important or not, but having a watch with the original bevels and case size and all of those details is what I really like to buy personally, and unfortunately, what my clients really like as well. And that's hard because with like 1950s and 1960s watches, maybe 1 out of 100 or less are actually kind of unpolished, original condition watches. Most have been polished if it ever went back for service to Rolex. Obviously, many watches have replaced bezel inserts, replaced hands, all these things that can drastically affect value. Um, so, yeah, of course, I'm always looking for good condition Rolex. Patek Philippe as well. I've more and more people looking for beautiful time only Patek Philippe watches to add to their collection. And I think it's kind of the natural progression of a collector. Maybe you become interested in vintage watches and you want the sport watches like a Submariner, an Omega Speedmaster, all of those. And then with time, you're thinking, oh, I'd like some dressier watches. I'm attracted to the purity of a time only Patek or Audemars Piguet or Vacheron Constantin, things like that. And then I think Cartier as well has kind of seen that renewed interest of late. Really great vintage Cartier watches are very hard to find.
Mm.
And there's tons of people that are like, oh, I'd love a 1960s tank, and they're just not something you can just go and buy in great condition. They're very hard to find. Um, Longines as well, I feel like, has a lot more people that are interested in it. And obviously, they made a lot of beautiful time only watches. They made unbelievably beautiful chronographs as well, back in the 30s through the 60s. But, the time onlys are very hard to find in nice condition.
Yeah, sure.
Hoyer is coming back to vintage Hoyer chronographs. A lot more interest in those. They're selling a lot quicker than they did, a year or two ago. So that's great.
Interesting. So I just want to sort of go back to something, you're talking about looking for, original unpolished condition. And I've read some interviews or some of your articles where you talk about the difference between the dial and the case. Like, as I understand it, vintage value is often heavily invested in the condition of the dial, whereas
Exactly.
it seems like you're almost an advocate of a good, honest or original case. Can you tell us what your sort of approach or thinking is with that?
Yeah. So there was a funny uh, podcast that came out last January. I was on Hodinkee Radio, and Ben Clymer and I had a brief point and counterpoint on dial versus case. But uh, the reality is, dial is critically important. A dial, in some cases, can be over 99% the value of the watch. And if a dial is heavily degraded, in terms of
Mm.
moisture wear, rust, whatever may have happened to it, that can drastically affect the watch's value. I find cases, of course, so I love beautiful mint dials as much as anyone else that's original. I am okay with a dial showing some patina. It doesn't need to be 10 out of 10 because one, that's so rare, and two, you almost have to be wary if you see something so perfect. The old adage, if it's too good to be true, it probably is.
Mm,
So you do have to be very careful, and there's a lot more sophisticated dial cleaning and restoration that didn't exist 5 years ago to make watches look kind of perfect. But cases, I just have always been attracted to these watches with the original cases and finishes and angles, kind of the architectural aspects of the watch, which get, you know, those, you lose all those minute special details as soon as the watch touches a buffing wheel, the case, everything kind of gets softened, and these nice edges get lost, and usually the shiny finishes are lost and everything's shiny or everything's buffed, and it's not sort of how these case makers, which were really artisans in Switzerland, would have wanted it to look when they designed it new. So yeah, I like a watch that has some scratches on the case. It doesn't have to be new old stock, and I like it just to be untouched if possible, and have those original bevels or chamfered edges that they say, and that kind of the thickness of the lugs and everything else that was originally there. And it's like an architectural thing. So I've seen a lot of watches with a lot of great dials that I felt, sad about seeing the condition of the case so polished and worn, when the
yeah.
watch would be so amazing if they had just left it.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So my next question is, it's around full sets. So obviously the case and the dial quality is paramount, but full sets are a really interesting phenomenon, especially in vintage Rolex, right? Because they seem to add a huge premium with no, I guess, intrinsic value other than the collectability, and with certain models that are rare, finding one with a full set is even rarer. Obviously, it speaks to provenance. If you can get things like service papers and the original sort of bill of sale. In your opinion, because I know that these are really hard to price for buyers and sellers, but in your opinion, is there a point of diminishing returns, and is this something that you're interested in as both a dealer and a collector?
Yeah, I say that like having a full set is sort of on the cherry on top, but to
Hmm.
me, it's kind of the third most important thing after the condition of the watch and the provenance. Then the full set thing is like a nice third place addition to the cake. Um, so I said something kind of controversial in my talk to the Horological Society of New York, which is that maybe most of the vintage Rolex full sets we see, so the majority, over 50%, are not original to the watches.
Hmm.
Um, there are so many that have been put together, for the last decades, because it would add roughly 20 to 25% as a general rule to the value of the watch. Of course, you could go buy a box for a few $100s and buy some unfilled papers for a few $100s and then write in the numbers and
Mm.
create some story about it. So, to me, a full set without provenance and without knowing where the watch came from is pretty worthless. And you can detect these things. I mean, I've seen some pretty ridiculous retailer stamps that look like they were put together at Hobby Lobby or some craft store, saying like Booker or Tiffany or Rolex New York. These things that look really silly, people stamp on the papers that clearly aren't correct. But um, it's always a nice thing to have, no question. But that's kind of the number one sign of a noob to the collecting
Mhm.
world, is when they come in and say, I only want to buy full sets. Then, as a collector friend of mine said, if someone comes into the collecting world and starts telling dealers, I only want to buy full sets, it's like having a sign on your back that says, rip me off. Because it means they know absolutely nothing about the condition of the watch, and they're
Yeah,
just buying
they
papers.
got they got a big budget. All right.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of provenance, I've got a question. If you had $5,000 and a time machine, when would you travel to, and what would you buy?
um, Probably the 1950s, and you could buy you could do some damage on a lot of great Patek Philippe watches from then. I think I have a 1956 or a 1957 Patek Philippe catalog, and you've got 1463 chronograph, 2526 with enamel dial, 2523 world time, which you know there are some of those have been selling at auction for over $5 million now, and
Okay.
a few other things in there that are crazy. 2499 first series. So you could buy a few of those pieces, add up to $5,000, and be walking away with $10 million now probably. But beyond the value, they're just incredible watches. Every one of them. It was just the apex of Patek Philippe in a sense. They're just the beauty, the artisan, the craftsmanship of each of these pieces. They were so special.
Amazing. That's a great answer. 1950s to tear up the Patek catalog. Well,
Yeah.
unfortunately, we do not have we don't have a time machine, uh, but we do have a budget, and I'm really curious to hear. This is another question Felix and I bounced around, was being a collector for for some time and a professional dealer and access to all of these networks. We're really curious to hear sort of if you've had one of those best buy moments, maybe in your career that you might be happy to share. Maybe it's because it was an amazing price, or maybe because it was just a ridiculous story. But I'd love to hear sort of the best acquisition you've made.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and it's hard to come up with one. The reality is there are great watches that you can buy, and you're making money, obviously. So, like one example of that is basically I was offered a Rolex GMT Master um, that was really didn't have a lot of information, but I learned it was full set. So I couldn't even get really a photo of this thing, but I offered, about 15,000, just assuming it was a matte dial watch, and I had the right to inspection, which was critical given that I couldn't get a photo of it. But I basically received it, and it turned out it was from the early 1960s, and um, they had already agreed to the $15,000 price, so it was worth like $50,000. So that was a very good return. um,
Nice.
I was assuming a matte dial GMT from like the 70s or early 80s or something. But that was good. But that's all great. But there's just some awesome watches I've hunted, for my personal collection, and that get me so excited. Whether it's eBay finds of some different Vulcan crickets that I love. One that had Breguet numerals at 12, 3, 6, and 9, and it was just a horrible auction and horrible photos. And I think um, I paid $300 for the watch, but it's the only one I've seen, and then turned out to be in mint condition. That's like the most joy you could imagine, just seeing something like that. Or this Seiko Golf watch that I purchased, which has a very similar case to the Patek Philippe 565. I found a collector who had it on Instagram, and I had never seen this watch before, and then my mouth kind of dropped when I saw it. I was like, such an oddball, exciting thing, and I paid him. I said, if you ever want to sell this, please let me know. And then a month later, he said I'd consider selling it, and I said, oh, what would you want for it? He said $1,500 US, and I said, yeah, you have a deal. And that's just a watch I'll keep forever. It was in mint condition, and really love it. It's a beautiful thing. um, yeah, I mean, I've tracked watches around the world, gone to interesting places to find them, whether in the US or other places. But I always get excited by any great watch. I guess one watch I was very excited about was a Rolex Small Crown Submariner that I bought this summer, which the it was from basically two sons. It was their father's watch, and their father worked for JFK. Um, and he bought the watch probably when he was stationed in Tehran in the late 1950s
Hmm.
for the U.S. government. But then he obviously wore it kind of throughout his life. But it was there's an amazing photo of him in a meeting next to JFK, and the watch is like 6 inches from JFK. So it's pretty crazy to see that photo. And then the watch, furthermore, was in mint condition, untouched case, all original, just a beautiful, beautiful example of a 1950s sub. Really was an incredible find, I think.
Lovely. Now, Eric, your Instagram, which we will of course link up, is it's just beautiful vintage watches, like row after row of like exceptional, lovely, lovely photographs of watches that most people would dream about. But I
Hmm.
notice sometimes a modern watch sneaks in there.
Yeah.
And one you put up recently that I just want to ask you about is Dan Henry.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about, for people listening that might not know what Dan Henry do and why, one of the world's best vintage expert is happily wearing one?
Yeah. I followed Dan Henry since he started the company. He's a Brazilian collector with a massive collection. Just a super nice guy. I bought basically what this model that they called the 1970 dive watch a couple years ago. That looks like a kind of 1960s super compressor style watch with the rotating bezel is inside the watch.
Hmm.
So it's got two crowns on the right side, one for the time, one for the bezel, placed at 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock. But I bought that. I liked it. I gave it to my dad. He wears it a lot. Um, and I like what he's doing generally. And he came out with a new model this year called the 1937 chronograph, dress chronograph. And I bought the silvered dial one, basically, where it doesn't have 24-hour time. It's just got the constant seconds and a minute register placed at 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. Um, and I just fell in love with the dial. It's got this incredible two-tone brushed finish, and it looks very similar to vintage Patek Philippe watches and other watches with silvered dials, where part of the watch has the silvered track. I don't really know how they made it so beautiful, basically, for a watch that's $270. And then, I liked that one so much, I got the same model, but in black with a copper print on the dial, which is very nice too. Again, $270. I didn't get a discount, and they're beautiful watches. I think I've sold probably a few for them since I've posted both. But
Of course.
people, it's great. It's really, and I do wear mine on occasion. It's nice to have a watch you don't have to think about, bumping into things if you're playing with the kids or out and about. But it's great. I've actually talked to Dan about whether we could do some sort of collaboration together on a watch,
Well, that'd be
which I would
cool.
love to do. Yeah.
Any early teasers on what that might look like, or
I,
too early?
too early, but also in the kind of 1930s style.
Mm.
Yeah, which
Now,
I love.
you mentioned there, and I think you passed over that. These are sort of $300 watches at the most.
Yeah.
And
No.
often they'll sort of cop some flack about being, like reproductions or, you know, not
Yeah.
quite.
I would say he doesn't get as much flack, thankfully, because he's inspired by things but doesn't do exact copies. Um,
Hmm.
a little bit different than the Uniracer controversy, which was kind of a direct copy of the Big Eye. Um, these are inspired by Patek Philippe or Longines or others, but he has his own kind of take on it, so it's not a direct copy, which is good. Um, they're of a style and of an era, hence why he makes them by year, but really with multiple influences, which is cool.
Very cool, very cool. And I think we interviewed Dan Henry, um, or the fan of Dan Henry, a long, long time ago, and I remember he's big into the flea markets
Yeah.
and really has made a lot of those barn finds. And
Yes.
that leads into sort of the other half of this conversation that we've sort of set up, and that's the selling side. So it's obvious that there's a lot that goes into buying watches, and I think a lot of people listening can learn from that.
Mhm.
But there's also selling it, and whether you're a dealer, looking to sell, or whether you've bought a watch looking to sell, I think there's some value to be learned from this side. So for for the listeners, where does Eric Wynn sell his watches?
Okay, so a few places. One, I sell obviously a lot to directly to clients,
Hmm.
often that I know are looking for something. Um, I thankfully have a number of very good clients and astute clients who love to see really nice vintage watches in good condition. So
Hmm.
if I offer them something, it usually doesn't take too long to sell it. People are always constantly letting me know what they're on the lookout for. I've tried kind of keeping some of that in Excel, which I do, but really my brain is my Excel. So it's more just remembering, oh, yeah, I remember this gentleman's looking for this watch. Let me send him a photo and see if it's of interest. And if it is, it's great. If not, that's okay. I typically just text people, through iMessage, and it's pretty easy. Um, a lot of the smaller watches, if you will, the sort of sub 10 and sub $5,000 watches, I sell through the Hodinkee shop, either
Hmm. That's
selling
cool.
to them or through them, and that's really allows me to focus my time on bigger pieces, obviously, and they have to deal with a lot of headaches of first time vintage watch buyers. I often say you don't want to sell someone their first vintage watch. It's not usually a pleasant thing because I've sold
Mhm.
people watches that didn't realize that the vintage watch, needed to be wound, either manual wind or automatic, and all of those sorts of issues. I've sold people vintage Daytonas that I thought realized had knew that they had to wind the watch every day, but didn't know that. And so they're telling me the watch is stopping and why is it
Probably not
not
waterproof
working?
either.
That's happened a couple times, and I'm like, actually, wait, are you winding it every day? And they're like, no. And I'm like, I'm sorry. I thought based on our conversation, you knew you have to unscrew the crown and wind it every day.
Yikes.
Um,
You have
but
to change your last name to Wind.
yeah, exactly. So,
Okay, so you
and
obviously
then,
have your website as well, and you
yeah,
sort of talked about
website,
Hodinkee where you put the smaller stuff.
Chrono
Uh,
24 and eBay as well.
yeah, perfect. So, and you mentioned it just before, and I think there's a little bit of a bigger question there. So obviously you have the site, you have these other platforms that you use,
Yep.
you do have stock. And what if I've learned anything, sort of having a bit of an interest in vintage watches, it's that there's a level of or an echelon of dealers that sort of get to a certain level where essentially it's moving pieces around their network, whether it's a few dealers to those clients you mentioned, where it's sort of spreadsheets, and it's not worth the effort of grabbing a watch, shooting it, putting it on your website, even posting it to Instagram is going to attract too much attention because you've sort of moved the watch from A to B.
Hmm.
Is this how it sort of works at that ultra high end of vintage pieces? And uh, is this the level that you're at with a lot of your business, where it's sort of moving, just sort of effectively moving pieces around?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's not uncommon. I mean, the the best or top dealers, if you will, have clients for the best quality stuff. So, it doesn't need to go on Instagram. It doesn't need to go anywhere, typically. Um, and I think people don't realize how hard it is to get really special, really great watches. And if you can't just kind of go online and get a great 1950s sport Rolex, it's not like you can just go get a great 1950s sub or GMT or Explorer. They don't stay listed for sale anywhere. They're gone, in a couple phone calls. So yeah, I think one of the broader misconceptions, and why in a sense you do need to pick your horse. And I see clients with all different sort of, philosophies and attitudes. And a lot of people come in with big egos and think they're just going to get great watches because they have money or whatever. And I had posted a really fantastic 6542, probably the best I've seen, that I had sold previously, but the owner was okay with me posting it. It was just a special watch, like really incredibly mint, great provenance. And then someone wrote me and was very angry I hadn't offered it to him. And I said, I probably could have sold this to 10 people. I sold it to someone I've done 7 figures of business with, and we've done $13,000 of business. So I sold you 2 watches, both under $10,000. You can't be offended that I didn't offer you this watch, man. So that's just the reality. These things are very liquid. Obviously, you have to think about all the different factors when you're selling a watch, and um, who would likely buy it and all those sorts of things. But yeah, the best watches in a sense are not being posted on Instagram by dealers for sale.
So how do you get into how do I get a relationship with you of that level? How do I crack into that network and join you there?
I think it's just saying, hey, I want to buy some serious things and I'm serious about it. And, this is what I want to buy. And then you kind of have to prove yourself. Not like it sounds very arrogant, but you have to prove that you're a real buyer, that you're not just a time waster, or as some dealers call them, tire kickers, that if you want to buy it, here's your chance. And then, either buy or don't, basically.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, and I mean, it's great to have someone sort of that caliber on the show. I think everyone can think of pretty easily the other dealers we're talking about, or those other
Yeah.
names that sort of are really top tier, and you can kind of buy from, sight unseen, blindly transfer the money, and just have total confidence. I think that's the other side of a relationship like that. So there is obviously
Yes.
value there for that top tier of client.
Hmm.
Um, we have another question for you. Now, you've obviously got that background at Christie's, and there's been a fair few legendary watches that we've seen auctioned over the last few years. The couple of Paul Newman Daytonas, the Monaco just recently that was, associated with Steve McQueen. If you could assemble a fantasy auction catalog, what, 3, 4, 5 watches would be in it?
Um, it's yeah, that's hard to say. I mean, there's a few. I thought the Haile Selassie 2497 we sold at Christie's was really special. Just everything about it was pretty amazing watch. Black dial perpetual calendar with radium on the dial, radium numerals, kind of taking this very elegant Patek perpetual calendar and making it into a military style watch, sport watch. It was really interesting. There's a Patek Philippe reference 1518. There's 4 in the John Goldberger Steel Patek book, but um, the last one, which is kind of an interesting configuration with blued hands, I would love to see come for auction. The 2499 in platinum, one of 2 made in platinum, which Christie sold in 2012 for about $4 million. I think that's 10 million plus today pretty easily. Um, Obviously, the Henry Graves super complication that went for $24 million in 2014. I think that would probably go for more today, significantly. And that's kind of the holy grail pocket watch or watch period. Then you can go, to things like something by George Daniels, Space Traveler, um, really, really exceptional, 1 or 2. Um, you can go to some of the Packard watches, the Caliber 89, the Vacheron 57 260, which they made, in the last decade, but is the most complicated watch ever. That'd be very interesting to see what that would achieve if it ever came up for auction. Going to be very good for Vacheron, obviously. There's some pretty amazing pieces out there, so it's Yeah.
The only problem is finding them, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, for the last little while, I think certainly the mainstream conversation about vintage has been dominated by Rolex and Patek, and I don't think that's set to change. But increasingly, you're seeing a lot more talk and a lot sort of those high premiums on independent brands like Universal Genève and more recently FP Journe. They're really getting up there.
Yeah.
What do you think is driving that?
The Journe, the whole Journe mania is very interesting because we're seeing. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen a price progression like we've seen. 2016, Philips has one of the Tourbillon subscription pieces for sale. It goes for 161,000 all in. 2020, they have one of the 20 watches again. Also Philips Geneva, so controlling for auction house and location that's a controlled variable.
Mm.
It's the same place, and it goes for $1.4 million. So you have it, go up an incredible amount in 4 years. Basically the exact same watch. Now, I think there's a few factors there. I should say, FP Journe laid the groundwork for creating a positive pre-owned market about
Hmm.
4 years ago when they started buying back important discontinued
Mm.
watches and servicing in them and reselling them. That was important because I remember, 4 and 5 years ago when I was working at Christie's, it was pretty hard to sell pre-owned Journe. There just were not buyers for it. So that developed to, there was more scholarship and promotion of his early watches, and then suddenly everyone wanted anything that had a brass movement, etc. So it kind of permeated through the collector community. Three, it kind of came at a time when a lot of the collectors of modern complicated Patek Philippe were getting, sort of tired or sick of the modern complicated Patek Philippe, and prices were getting clobbered, on pre-owned models. Some of these ultra complicated pieces, when you walk out the door, you're losing 30 or 40% or more.
Hmm.
And, people don't want to buy things like that. So a lot of the big Journe buyers now, 5 years ago, were big modern Patek Philippe collectors. And I heard secondhand from someone who was at a Journe collector dinner recently that one of the guys was saying Journe is so much better than Patek Philippe. When I was collecting Patek Philippe, I could get any application piece, as they call them, I wanted. Journe, you can't get anything, and you have to get on your hands and knees and beg, and you still can't get anything. So it's almost the allure of trying to get something you can't have.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think you mentioned the auctions again, and it's really good to have you on because of that background that you do have. And I have a bit of it's a long question and it's a two-parter, so bear with me. But this is something I'm really curious for your take on, and and it's from the perspective of sort of buying watches and then pricing them for sale. So you've mentioned we've seen some pretty ridiculous prices via auction. Sorry, if I think of a recent example, it's that Racing Pulse auction Phillips did,
Mm-hmm.
and it almost became apparent that just sort of having a watch in the auction threw on a premium because it was sold alongside, 3 or 4 important watches.
Yes.
And that's the premium that's added on top of, the buyer's premium.
Yeah.
When you're buying your stock and you're building in your margin, what do you do when someone pulls out, a listing like that as a comparison? What's the conversation that takes place there?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I typically say, well, you have to factor in a few things. One, the number you're seeing has 26% premium added to it.
Hmm.
Two, there's typically buyer's commission as well. So say you have a watch that's listed for they hand you the sheet and they say, look, this Rolex Daytona just sold for 126,000 in auction, and you're offering me 95 or 100,000 for it. Why should I take that? It's like, one, the seller is getting it's $100,000 premium plus premium on the watch. So it's 100,000 is the hammer price, as we say, and then 26,000 added. Then you have a seller's commission, which could be as high as 12.5% at
Hmm.
at Christie's, so that person's taking home $87,500. There's also time value of money, so you could be consigning the watch now. They're already taking consignments for the June auction, say in New York. You won't get paid until July at the earliest. So you have to decide if you can wait that long. 3, watches do get damaged sometimes or stolen during previews. It's a sad thing, but these watches get knocked around. If that happens, you'll only get paid half of basically the mid estimate. So if your watch is valued at $30,000 to $60,000, you'll only get $45,000 back if someone steals the watch, and maybe the watch would go for a lot more. But that won't be a good day if that happens. So it's really only insured at the mid estimate, and those are sort of the typical things I would raise. And then you don't know. Obviously, the global economy could crash at any time. You have currency issues if you're selling your watch in a different venue. Maybe the Swiss franc moves against the US dollar, so it might be worth less what you're getting back when it sells than it would be. Just many different factors to consider. And there are some watches that I just say, hey, this is such a unique thing, it's very hard to value, it should go to auction. And I think auction is good for something that is very hard to value. It's very hard to find buyers for. I mean, a good example of that is a Rolex we sold when I was at Christie's with a cloisonné enamel dial that had been in this gentleman's family for a while. The best offer he got from any dealers was $25,000, and we sold it for over $300,000. But we had the right buyers and the right two people that really wanted it, which as a dealer you couldn't necessarily find, and they might not have paid anywhere near that if they were just being offered it by a dealer.
Yeah, okay. Very good. Very good answer. I guess part two is, relates more to a bit we've talked about, and specifically like the minutia of vintage watches, where those tiny details can make a huge difference in price. So, and it comes back to that pricing element. What's your guiding principle when sort of it's a Mark One this with an original bezel, but it's been slightly polished, but it has a full set. How do you price this vintage stuff when it is so unique? Or obviously you might say, well, yes, I'm interested. I'm not going to say go to auction, but also there's a 30 or 40 or 50,000 sort of range that it could be in. How do you have that conversation?
Yeah, I think it goes along similar lines. It's I wouldn't really change anything I just said to be. It's very, at the end of the day, auction is just a total wild card, and there are. I mean, one good example of this is there were two Zenith A. Cairelli watches for the Italian Air Force that were for sale in spring 2016 in Geneva. So one was at Phillips in their start stop reset auction in May in Geneva, and then the other was in the Christie's auction a one day later. In the Phillips auction, it went for $55,000 or somewhere in that range. And then the next day, very comparable watch at Christie's went for $13,000. Why was that the case? Everyone's puzzled and befuddled. It's not a particularly rare watch. We learned after the fact, secondhand, that the gentleman who bought the one at Phillips, who was one of their major clients, bid on that one accidentally instead of a Universal Genève Cairelli, which is a different watch, much rarer. When he realized his mistake, he basically told the Phillips crew, like, I'm not buying it. I'm really sorry, but you have to make it go away. And typically they would say pound sand, either you're buying it or you're banned from ever bidding again. But this is a gentleman who bought 7 figures of watches, so I think
They made
they
it go
made the
away.
sale not stick, but it still shows up online as if the sale stuck. So it's a that's a good example. I say all the time I've heard of watches that weren't paid for, but the auction results still show up online.
Fascinating.
And you don't know if it's completed or not. And I found a sort of startling trend when I was leaving Christie's of people bidding on things and not paying. And then
Hmm.
you've got sellers who are really in trouble because Christie's doesn't take a financial position. If they're not paid, you just get the property back, and it's just gone through. None of the auction houses do unless there's a guarantee, but if it's not paid for, you just get the watch back, and you've lost all this time, and the watch is kind of quasi burned now because the whole world's seen it. Maybe it's been damaged during the global preview, all of these issues.
Wow, that's a side of, I guess, the whole equation that you don't think about.
Exactly, yeah.
I just want to sort of shift gears from the minutiae of the fine auction world for a second. Um, I assume that, like me, and like I reckon Andy as well, people send you Antiques Roadshow clips every so often.
Yes.
I always get the two, like the veteran with his GMT Master and
Yes.
that Vietnam veteran who fell over with his Daytona.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
I think they're really, for me, they're really good ways for people to sort of get into the why vintage watches are cool, and
Yes.
try and sort of explain why people go nuts over them. How do
Yep.
you sell the concept of vintage to your aunt or something at a holiday gathering?
Yeah. I guess in brief, I like vintage watches because they have a little more character, patina, history. I find the details of the watches themselves are a bit more artisanal, hand done kind of bevels and finishing on the top of Rolexes from the 1960s looks a lot different than just a produced Rolex today where everything's shiny on your new Daytona or whatever. There's no differentiating factor. They all look the same. Obviously, history and time and wear has made all of these watches unique too. But I think it's about preserving history. I like old things generally, not just watches, but just harkening back to a little different era before planned obsolescence, before um, you know the commodification of luxury and everything else. Something that's really really special that was meant to be a tool, but because of its construction and the time people put in, remains something that should last for hundreds of years.
Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. I've got a couple of questions left around vintage Rolex. Obviously, we've seen a lot of craziness happen over the last couple of years. Specifically, vintage Rolex. Maybe call it the last 3 years. Even 2020 was quite strong. Do you think that? What do you think of the current state of vintage Rolex specifically? Do you think it's slowed down at all?
I don't think so. I think it's got a lot more people today. Certain categories have changed a little bit. So there are definitely trends on the high end between
Mm-hmm.
what's exciting and what's not. At this moment, big crowns are a little bit soft for some reason. I think part of that is a bunch of collectors bought them in Asia. So we're talking about the 6538 and 6200 references of Submariner with an 8mm crown. Um, they're not so easy to sell right now. People aren't really coming out of the woodwork looking to buy those. And there are more people that would be interested in selling them than there are buyers out there.
Mm.
At these, big 6-figure price levels, some of these can be $1 million watches. Um, right now, Paul Newman Daytonas are extremely hot. And if I had 5 or 10 of them, I could sell them all if the prices were in line with the market. They're just a lot of buyers out there for those right now, and they're just not. There are none around, and people that have them don't want to sell them, even if I offer them big numbers. And other watches we've seen kind of. I mean, then you've got the sort of under $30,000 kind of sport Rolex range, which has just been on fire. Whether it's
Mm-hmm.
1990s 5-digit watches taking off in value a lot the last few years, there's still a bargain. Like a 16610 reference from the 1990s might be $9,000 when the brand new Submariner is something like 16,000 brand new or something secondhand. I'd rather have the 1990s one personally.
Mm-hmm.
And seems like a good value. It's below the retail price even for a new one, which is 9,000 something. So there's still room there. Great 1960s and 1970s Rolex watches, which is kind of the majority of things that I sell, like GMT Masters, Submariners, Explorers. Those are really hard to find in great condition, and if you get something that's really great, you can sell it 10 times over in a few days, but not so easy to find in great condition.
Amazing. Well, speaking of Paul Newman Daytonas and finding things in great condition, there's a fantastic story that we spoke about a couple of years ago, and I want you to retell it because I think it's a really great sort of note to end this part of the show on.
Yeah.
But I think it was like 2017. Crazy Rich Asians. Obviously, there's the Paul Newman Daytona that features within the film,
Yeah.
and you had a bit of a hand to play within it. Can you tell us sort of the story in a nutshell and what was involved and what you actually did there?
Yeah, I'll do the brief one. If you're interested in a longer version of the story, you can read it on my blog.
Perfect.
The story behind the Crazy Rich Asians, Paul Newman Daytona. But basically, I got a call or an email on a Monday morning from Kevin Kwan, who is a friend, the author of Crazy Rich Asians. And he said, we're filming a watch scene in Malaysia on Wednesday or Thursday, but we need the watch by Wednesday for this Thursday scene. Right now, all we have is an Hublot that this character Astrid is giving her husband, but we don't really feel that would be an appropriate gift for Astrid to give her husband. She seems more tasteful and classy than that. Is there something else you could find us in basically the next 48 hours or less? Less than that, given the time change, 36 hours. And I'm thinking, oh, wow, this is a tremendous opportunity because it should be a big movie. It's great opportunity. So let me start calling people, clients, friends, even modern watch companies, and see if they have anything. Now, granted, even if I ran to the airport, it would be hard because it's about 24 hours of travel to get there plus the time change. So I would be just getting there in time, and I wasn't about to do that. I was still working at Christie's. So I was calling up all kinds of local collectors, friends. Most people, when I talked to them, were like, Crazy Rich Asians, what are you talking about? They had never heard of the book. They're like, this sounds horrible. No, I'm not giving my watch to someone, out of my custody and care. So I called Eric Koo, or texted him and basically explained the situation over the phone. And he said, "There's a great opportunity. Let's try to." Actually, I've got a client in Singapore. Let me ask him. This gentleman had a Paul Newman, and as the positive effect, his wife read the book and loved it. So that was a huge barrier we overcame, and he was then furthermore okay with them picking up his Paul Newman Panda Daytona in Singapore and bringing it to Malaysia for the filming, without it being under his custody. So it all worked out. Basically, they sent a security guard, flew to Singapore, picked up the watch, flew it back to Malaysia, had the watch, used it in the scene, which was all of about 2 seconds in the final cut. But thankfully, the director, John Chu, said, I knew we needed to keep the watch in the movie because I knew it was a huge amount of work to get it. So we had to make sure we included it in the final cut of the film. It was just pretty incredible. The movie comes out. Some people are on Rolex forums saying, there's a Paul Newman in the movie. I just saw it. It must be a fake. and then it was like, no, it's not a fake. It's actually real. as wrote the blog article about what happened and kind of the more details in that, and then I sent it to the prop managers who I was working with on this, and they said, "Wow, that's incredible! It's like reliving, what happened basically a year and a half ago." Uh, and we didn't tell you this, but the security guard who had the watch, um, actually, we found him asleep on the bed with the watch next to him, so we had
Oof.
to fire him.
Oof.
But
Whoa.
it's pretty funny.
Oof.
But that was the final cap on it. But the watch made it back, and it's forever immortalized in the film.
That's really cool, and it must be great for the it's a good story for the owner of that watch as well
Yeah, yeah,
to
it
add
is
to it.
cool.
And
It's
it's
very
something
cool.
I can't imagine that they would have done in a movie, 15, 20 years ago, just gone to that level of effort. I think it's
Yeah,
really great.
it showed just they really did take great effort with everything they did with that movie to make it accurate, and make it look appropriate. Even so, it looked, I think, even far more expensive than the budget was, which was
Mm.
not insignificant. But it really made it feel even more lavish and over the top. If they were willing to go to this much effort to get a watch in a 2-second scene, they were really going to great efforts to make this house, which was where a lot of it took place, the grandmother's house, which was actually a rundown house. Apparently, it was like abandoned and full of monkeys and monkey feces. They cleaned it up so it looked like this incredible mansion in Singapore and everything else.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, Eric, we are just about to wrap up. It's been wonderful chatting to you about the world of vintage and getting some of those real inside tips. But I'm hoping you've got one final tip for us that has nothing to do with watches.
Yeah.
What have you been, passing the time with at the moment? Pun intended. Maybe something you've been reading or watching or listening to that has nothing to do with work or the real world.
Yeah. Well, I've almost through, but I've been watching Chernobyl, which I'm a bit behind on HBO, but absolutely riveting. Maybe my favorite miniseries ever,
Really?
and really loving it. Have you watched it?
I don't think I could. I'm leaning towards a lighter entertainment at the moment. I'm not quite at the almost
Yeah.
nuclear holocaust.
Yeah, my wife's like, why, like, she likes lighter fare as well, and I'm like just loving digging into this, and she's like, "This is too intense for me. I can't watch it."
I'm with your wife.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Anything
crazy.
else?
Um, I I guess I've been, I'm always looking at watch books, so working through a few different ones at the moment, like Time to Race, which is John Goldberger's more recent book. Of course, most watch books are kind of picture books, but I like things that have a bit more meat. And I read um, Lake Success by Gary Steingart recently, which features some great watch scenes as well.
Cool.
So
That's a good
that's
suggestion.
coming out on HBO, I think, as a mini series. But there's a lot of good watch content in there, so I recommend that novel a lot.
Awesome.
Fantastic. Good recommendations. Well,
Yeah,
Eric, thank you so much for joining us. It was a really insightful and interesting chat, and I feel like we've scraped the surface of the stories that you have to share. So this might not be the last time we get you on, but we'll link everything up, and we'll link up your website and obviously your Instagram handle. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
thank you so much, Felix and Andy. It was a blast.
Andy, we said it at the start that Eric Wind is a gentleman, and I think
A
that
scholar.
yes, I think that chat only confirmed it. He is a lovely, lovely man that knows a lot about timepieces and buying them and selling them.
Mm.
And now you, as listeners to this, know a little bit more about all that sort of stuff as well. So thank you, Eric. And as always, thank you to our sponsors, Casio G-Shock Australia. Who else do we need to thank, Andy?
Major Tom Media, of course, for producing the show, pulling it
major.
all together. Thank you guys all for listening. We appreciate the reviews, the subscribing, the sharing.
Apple
Make sure
reviews.
you're emailing us.
Yeah, do some of that stuff.
Apple reviews make a huge difference.
Yeah.
Yeah, we love charting in different parts.
If you want,
keep us on the charts.
wow, yeah. If you're in, what countries should we get on the list, Andy? We haven't spoken about your fascination of countries recently.
We still need to get Greenland on the list.
Okay, so share us with all of your Scandi.
If you have
buddies.
someone in Greenland that you know, just find them, DM it to them, and say you pay them $5 to download the episode.
We will pay. I think.
Email us.
Yeah.
otthepodcast@gmail.com. Hit us on Instagram, ot.podcast. We will see you guys next week. Thank you all.
Thank you, Greenland.
Thank you, Greenland.